Welcome to Forces of Flight. This is Dustin Drews, your host. Please take a brief second, push the subscribe button in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. Today we'll be covering aeronautical decision making. This comes from the advisory circular about ADM and Chapter 2 of the PHAC. Aeronautical decision making, or ADM as most people call it. Your DPE and your CFI and all your training will be done around ADM. What is it? Well, ADM is a decision making in a unique environment that we call aviation. It's a systematic approach to the mental process used by pilots to consistently determine the best course of action in response to a given circumstance. Basically, it's to teach you how to make decisions if you're not fully competent at making decisions in aviation. So how did ADM get started? Well, the Federal Aviation Administration wanted to produce training directed at improving the ADM of pilots. This led to the current FAA regulations that require that decision-making be taught as part of the pilot training curriculum. ADM research, development, and testing started in 1987 with the publication of 6 manuals oriented to the decision-making needs of various rated pilots. The manuals provided material designed to reduce the number of decision-related accidents. ADM continues on today, and it will be a large portion of your check ride. It is laid out in the ACS, so you best know it. Does using ADM work? Well, believe it or not, you can train people to make better decisions. The effectiveness of these materials were validated in independent studies, where student pilots received such training in conjunction with the standard flying curriculum. When tested, the pilots who had received ADM training made fewer in-flight errors than those who had not received the ADM training. The difference between the two types of training was significant and ranged from about 10 to 50% fewer judgment errors and a whopping 54% reduction in accident rates after using these materials. So, all this information actually serves a purpose, and it actually keeps you 54% safer. Why is ADM important? ADM is very important to you as a pilot. Why is this? Everyone makes decisions daily. We all must have some sort of decision-making process in our life. In aviation, we use ADM to expose hazards. All these models cover the same elements of a flight, just in a different way. So we can use these models to expose the hazards. Then we do a risk assessment of the hazards to identify the probability of the hazard becoming a reality during our flight. So what are the different elements of a flight? Well, let me explain what we're trying to do with these elements. With these elements, we're trying to expose the hazards that are related to them. And if you look in Chapter 2 of the PHAC, they talk about the different elements of a flight. The plan element, the pilot, the passenger, the plane, the programming, and the pressure. These are all different elements of a flight that can bring up hazards to our flight. So we're going to break down each one of them in the next couple slides so we can expose the hazards that might accompany the different elements of the flight. So now that we know where we need to look for hazards, let's look at the plan element. Weather, airport conditions, terrain, airspace. All these different parts of the plan element can affect our flight. Weather is one of the largest risks a pilot can deal with on a flight. Clouds, wind, fog, icing, thunderstorms, all can cause unneeded hazards to a flight. Another bad one is terrain. CFIT, controlled flight interterrain. This is a huge deal for general aviation. So you got to make sure we know about our terrain and all the hazards associated with it. Airspace. Imagine if you fly through a temporary flight restricted area or over an active MOA, which is a military operation area. These could all cause hazards to your flight. Elements of a flight. Okay, the pilot element, right? Me and you. So we got to look at ourselves. Fitness, general health, stress level, fatigue. All these can affect our performance and our decision-making abilities. Then we got to look at the proficiency. Okay, this is different than currency because your biannual flight review only requires you to be reviewed every 24 months. We might be current, right? But we might not be proficient. There's a big difference. Currency is basically being legal, and proficient is like, okay, would I take my kid with me flying if I haven't flown in 23 months? Training. This affects your ability to make a proposed flight and manage different situations in the flight. Say you're trained on one GPS and you're perfectly comfortable with it, and you switch over to a G1000 that's full glass as you've never touched. You need training to make you proficient. Experience. Okay, if you've only flown in clear bluebird days and you go take off and it's a gusty spring day with lots of heat bubbles coming off the ground, probably not a good idea without a CFI on board. It can definitely affect the outcome of your flight because you've never experienced the conditions. Hazardous attitudes, okay? Every pilot has them. You're either anti-authority, you have impulsivity, your invulnerability, your macho, and your resignation. All these hazardous attitudes, we got to examine ourselves and look at them really in depth. Me, I have a little bit of impulsivity, like, hey, let's go someplace, and a little bit macho. So, like, let's go do this, and oh yeah, I got it, we're good. That's my two hazardous attitudes. They're fine as long as you know how to control them. And then currency. We talked about it earlier. This is what you need to perform the flight legally. It's completely different than proficient. Think of currency as what you got to prove in court, proficiency as what you do to take your kid along with the flight. Let's look at the passenger element of a flight. Okay, experience has a lot to do with it. If you got a person that's used to flying with small general aviation, it's not going to be much of an issue. But if you got a kid or a person that's unfamiliar with flying in small aircraft, it can definitely cause an issue. Health-wise, right? If you got a person that gets really motion sickness, that can cause a lot of issues on a flight because you're focused on helping them use a six-ack or trying to keep everything calm. Your focus is on them, not outside the cockpit like it should be. Another thing we need to look at is flexibility. If we're taking somebody on a flight to, say, a wedding, we have a lot of pressure on us to make that flight, right? So flexibility is a big deal. Make sure your passengers have a backup plan to get there in case we have a flat tire or something's wrong with the plane that keeps us from taking off. And lastly is fitness. We kind of touched on health issues, but let's really dive into health issues. Say we got a person that has a heart problem that doesn't bother him on the ground, but once he gets up in elevation, his heart isn't pumping blood good enough, and he's not getting enough oxygen, and he starts getting hypoxia, and he's not even close to being over the legal limit on altitude. These issues can all cause pressures to a pilot on a flight. So make sure we look at the passenger when we're flying, whether he's old or young. Ask them if they've ever been on a small airplane flight. If they're a kid, make sure they're strapped in good, and just look at all elements of the passenger that can cause hazards to our flight. So let's look at the plane element. I mean, this thing could go on forever. We're going to try and keep it as short as possible. But first, we got to look at the legality of it, right? Is the plane airworthy? Can we take off? When I say airworthy, I mean it's got all the checks in the box of tomato flames to make a day flight or flaps to make a night flight. And I won't even get into instrument rating flights. And then the performance, right? How many people are we taking? What do they weigh? What are they bringing along? Can this airplane complete the mission? Does it have the performance to complete the mission? Also talking about performance, is it a really hot day with a high density altitude? Is that going to affect our takeoff? Can we take off in these conditions at this load? All this goes into effect on the plane element. Configurations, right? So is a plane configured all the way through the flight? Takeoff, landing, en route. Are we checking the mixture? All the configurations, if we don't have them set, it can cause a hazard to a flight. Even something as simple as not turning on the lights for a configuration can cause us a hazard. And lastly, equipment. I kind of touched on this earlier. Does a plane have the necessary equipment to perform the flight? There's a acronym called tomato flames, or a tomato flames, excuse me, and that kind of goes through of all the requirement equipment that a plane needs to perform the flight. So the programming element, this refers to our avionics, right? Is it airworthy? Is it legal? Is it up to date? Another part of our avionics, is it operational? Are you proficient with it? The configuration of our avionics can cause us hazards, right? You got the stuff that's just type it in and you follow the magenta line, and you got stuff that's integrated with your autopilot. And that leads us to another thing. Are you familiar with autopilot? Do you know how to use autopilot? All these can cause undue hazards in a flight if we don't know how to use the equipment that we use to program our plane. So the pressure element of a flight. This is anything that's going to put pressure on us as pilots to do something. Whether it's a storm rolling in, whether it's icing might happening, anything, wind's going to be picking up, certain timelines like we talked about earlier, getting to a wedding, a business meeting, a funeral, not having a backup plan for where we're going. That puts a pressure on us that we have to make this flight. And also, another thing we need to look at is like emotional pressure. Are we emotional? Did we just lose our job? If I don't make this flight, am I going to be able to pay my bills if I'm a commercial pilot? Everything you can think of that puts pressure on us as pilots to make a flight needs to be looked at really closely in the pressures element. And the reason being is the more pressure we put on ourselves, the bigger hazard we can be to ourselves. So in ADM, we have two things, right? We have hazards and we have risk. Why do we make decisions? We make decisions to put ourselves in a better situation than we were before. We rarely ever choose to willingly put ourselves in a worse position with our decisions. So ADM is no different. To get a better outcome, we need to identify the hazards from the elements we talked about earlier, and then perform risk assessments of each and one of the hazards to help us make better decisions. What is a hazard? A hazard is a real or perceived condition, event, or circumstance that a pilot encounters that can have a negative impact on the flight. For instance, hitting a bird is a hazard we face as pilots while in flight. So what is a risk? Well, we had the hazard of hitting a bird in the last slide. So a risk is an assessment of the hazard facing a pilot, and then we evaluate the probability of it affecting the flight. So, for instance, we're taking off at a runway that has water around it. Makes sense. Let's get into the airport facilities directory, open it up, and see if they have any bird hazards. And if they do, let's evaluate the risk of it happening. When using ADM, we identify all the hazards that are associated with the elements of flight. Then we evaluate each of the risks by using risk assessments of each hazard to rate the probability of them happening. So probable, this is an event that will likely occur several times. An occasional, this is an event that will probably occur sometime. Remote, this is an event that is unlikely to occur, but it is possible. Improbable, this event is highly unlikely to occur. Once we figure out the probability of each one of the hazards through a risk assessment, we need to cover the severity of that hazard if the hazard becomes a reality. Catastrophic, this results in fatalities and a total loss of the aircraft. Critical, severe injury or major damage to an aircraft. Marginal, minor injury or minor damage to the airplane. And then negligible, less than minor injury, less than minor damage to a system. To simplify all this, we need to identify all the hazards associated with the flight, rate them on the severity, and then make choices dealing with these hazards so that there's an improbable chance that they will occur. When using ADM, we have two different types of decision-making processes, one being analytical and the second automatic. Analytical decision-making is a well-thought-out checks and balance approach to making a decision. When using ADM, we have three different ADM analytical models that the FAA talks about. These help guide our decision-making process, and we'll cover each one of these in depth. The three processes are the decide model, the 5P model, and the 3P model. Then we also have automatic decisions. Automatic decisions are decisions that we make automatically, hence the name. These decisions are made almost instantly and are almost a form of programming. The reason they are made so quickly is they are a result of training and experience. The more training one has, the faster they can make decisions when put into a situation. We will cover more on this in depth later on. The decide model of ADM. In this model, you go through all the elements of a flight that we talked about earlier and detect a list of hazards pertaining to the flight. Then use the DECIDE acronym to handle the hazards that we have identified. The D stands for detect, the problem. The decision maker detects the fact that the change has occurred. E, estimate, need to react. The decision maker estimates the need to counter or react to the change. C, choose. Choose an action. The decision maker chooses a desirable outcome in terms of success for the flight. I, identify. These are solutions. The decision maker identifies actions which could successfully control the change. D, do. The necessary actions. The decision maker takes the necessary action to fix the problem. E, evaluate. The effect of the action. So the decision maker evaluates the effects of his or her actions countering the change. The decide model requires you to go through the elements of a flight to detect the hazard. To use this model, you must have a complete grasp on the elements of a flight. It does not give you an additional acronym to help you remember the flight elements like the 5P and the 3P models. The Analytical 5P model. This model lists out the 5 basic elements of a flight and lets you analytically evaluate each one of them independently. What makes this one different is it lists out the different elements of a flight so they should not get overlooked like they could using the decide model. The 5 Ps are used to evaluate the pilot's current situation at key decision points during the flight or when emergency arises. These decision points include pre-flight, pre-takeoff, hourly, or at the midpoint of a flight, pre-descent, and just prior to the final approach fix for IFR, or for VFR, just prior to entering the traffic pattern. The 5P concept relies on the pilot to adopt scheduled reviews of each of the elements. The elements, like we talked about earlier, are the plan, meaning mission, the plane, well that's explanatory, the pilot, I'm safe, the illness, medicine, stress, alcohol, fatigue, and emotion, we'll cover that on another lesson, the passengers, like we covered earlier, and the programming. With each of the 5 different Ps covering the 5 different elements of a flight, we can expose the hazards associated with each element and then choose the best course of action to mitigate the risk concerning each element. The 3P analytical model. The 3 Ps stand for perceive, process, and perform. Along with the 3 Ps, this model uses 3 other acronyms known as PAVE, CARE, and TEAM. This model is a simple, practical, and systematic approach that can be used in all phases of flight. To use it, the pilot will perceive the given set of circumstances for a flight, process them by evaluating their impact on flight safety, and perform by implementing the best course of action. Perceive. In the first step, the goal is to develop situational awareness by perceiving hazards, which are events, objects, or circumstances that could contribute to an undesired future event. By using the PAVE checklist, it covers all the elements of a flight and you use it to identify the hazards of each. The P, pilot, the A, the airplane, the V, environment, and the E, external pressures. Same thing of the 5P model or the elements of a flight model, just said in a different way. Then we process in the second step, right? The goal is to process this information to determine whether the identified hazards constitute risk, which is designed as future impact of a hazard that's not controlled or eliminated. By using the CARE checklist to evaluate their impact on the safety of the flight and to consider why must I care about these circumstances. So, care, consequences. What are the consequences of the hazards? What are the alternatives of the hazards? What are the realities of the hazards? And what are the external pressures related to these hazards? So we have all our hazards, we've evaluated them, now we're going to perform, right? In the third step, the goal is to perform by taking action to eliminate or mitigating the risk, and then continuously evaluate the outcome of this action by using the team checklist to deal with each factor. So can we transfer the hazard to somebody else? Say we're flying along, we have a pilot sitting next to us that's instrument rated, we're not. We're getting ready to fly in the clouds. Can we transfer the airplane controls to that pilot to mitigate the hazard? Can we eliminate it completely? Say we're all alone up there, we're not instrument rated, we see a cloud. Can we turn around and go the opposite direction and eliminate it? See where I'm getting at? Then, can we accept this hazard, right? Like, it's not going to be a big deal. We can accept it. And then how can we mitigate the hazard or make it less likely to happen? Once the pilot has completed the 3P decision-making process and selected a course of action, the process begins anew, because now the set of circumstances brought about by the course of action requires analysis. The decision-making process is a continuous loop of perceiving, processing, and performing. I apologize this one went on so long and it's hard to make it flow, and sorry it was choppy. But this is the model that my DPE asked me about. So of all of them, this is the one that I had to learn the most. And this model is the most in-depth of all the analytical models. So checks and balances. So when we use ADM analytically, we must remember that as things change during a flight, the changes can affect other things. So no matter which analytical model we choose to follow, we need to constantly be going over each element of a flight in real time during the flight. The Decide, 5P, and 3P models can help us make better decisions concerning the different elements of a flight, but we must continue to use ADM throughout the duration of our flight to prevent future problems from happening. Automatic decisions. These are my favorite types of decisions to make because they happen without me thinking about them. Automatic decisions are extremely valuable in aviation. These are the reasons we have our requirements to get our various ratings. But the only way we get automatic decisions is from training and repetition. The more we train, the more times we do things, the more automatic it becomes in our mind and in our body. It becomes second nature over time, and it happens without us even realizing it. Things like learning to take off, land, radio calls, etc. all become automatic in our mind, and we do not even need to think about how it's going to happen. Luckily for us, it just happens. Well, if you haven't pushed the subscribe button in the lower right-hand corner, I urge you to do so. And I hope this simplifies the two different types of decision-making processes for you. By now, you should be able to understand the difference between analytical and automatic decisions. You should be able to grasp the three different ADM, analytical decision-making models. And finally, you should be able to use ADM to help you navigate through the different elements of a flight to identify the hazards and calculate the risk of each of them. Again, this is Dustin. Thanks for watching. Until next time, try and get airborne.